Captain Sarah Chun pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the sound of boots echoing through the abandoned warehouse. Her heart pounded as she counted at least 12 enemy soldiers moving through the building below. The mission was supposed to be simple reconnaissance, but everything had gone wrong in the worst possible way. 3 hours earlier, she had been part of Delta Squad, an elite intelligence unit tasked with gathering information about enemy supply routes in the war-torn city of Kralovec. The team consisted of 5 highly trained soldiers: herself, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, Sergeant James Park, Corporal Lisa Wong, and Private Tommy Sullivan. They had worked together for 2 years, through dozens of successful missions across 3 different conflict zones. The insertion had gone smoothly. Their helicopter had dropped them 2 kilometers outside the city under cover of darkness. The team moved through the ruins like ghosts, using hand signals and staying in formation. Sarah had trained these soldiers herself, and she trusted each one with her life. That trust would prove to be a terrible mistake. The warehouse district was their primary target. The warehouse wasn't abandoned. It was full of enemy soldiers, at least 30 of them, all heavily armed and alert. They had set up what looked like a command center in the middle of the space, with communication equipment, maps, and weapon caches. This wasn't just a supply depot. It was a major operational base. Sarah immediately activated her radio to warn the rest of her team. Delta 2, this is Delta 1. We have a major enemy presence at target location. Abort current mission and move to extraction point immediately. Rodriguez's voice crackled back through her earpiece. Copy that, Delta 1. We're seeing movement in our sector too. Something's not right here. That's when Sarah heard the sound that would haunt her for months afterward. It was the distinctive whine of incoming artillery shells. Someone had called in a bombardment on their position. The first explosion hit the building next to her, sending chunks of concrete and twisted metal flying through the air. Sullivan cried out as shrapnel tore through his leg, and Park dove for cover behind a burned-out truck. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening. The artillery barrage was too precise, too focused on their exact locations. The enemy knew where they were, knew their positions down to the meter. Someone had given them detailed information about the mission. Delta 2, report your status. Sarah shouted into her radio as another explosion shook the ground beneath her feet. Rodriguez's voice came back strained and panicked. We're taking heavy fire. Wong is down. The enemy was waiting for us, Sarah. They knew we were coming. Sarah's worst fears were confirmed when she heard Rodriguez give an order that made her stomach drop. All units, execute Emergency Protocol 7. Repeat, Emergency Protocol 7 is now in effect. Emergency Protocol 7 was a last resort measure that called for immediate evacuation of all personnel, leaving behind anyone who couldn't move on their own. It was designed for situations where the mission had been completely compromised and survival took priority over everything else. But Rodriguez was implementing it wrong. He was supposed to wait for her command as the team leader. Instead, he was abandoning the mission and her team without authorization. Negative on Protocol 7. Sarah transmitted, I am still in command of this operation. There was no response. Her radio had gone dead. Sarah watched in disbelief as Park suddenly stood up from his cover position and began moving away from her location. She called out to him, but he didn't respond. He was following Rodriguez's orders, abandoning her and Sullivan without a word. Sullivan was losing blood fast from his leg wound, and Sarah knew she had to make a decision quickly. She could try to carry him to the extraction point, but that would slow them down significantly. The enemy was closing in, and the artillery barrage was getting more intense. Sullivan, can you move? She asked, kneeling beside the young soldier. I can try, ma'am, he replied through gritted teeth. But I'm not going to make it far like this. Sarah looked around desperately for options. The warehouse full of enemy soldiers was still her best source of intelligence, but accessing it now seemed impossible. Then, she noticed something that changed everything. There was a maintenance tunnel entrance partially hidden behind some debris about 50 meters away. If she could reach it, she might be able to get underneath the warehouse and gather the intelligence they came for. But it would mean leaving Sullivan behind. The young private seemed to read her thoughts. Ma'am, you need to complete the mission. Don't worry about me. I'll find somewhere to hide until the extraction team can come back. Sarah felt a surge of anger at her teammates who had abandoned them. These were soldiers she had trained, people she had trusted with her life on dozens of previous missions. Now they were running away at the first sign of real danger, leaving her and Sullivan to face the enemy alone. I'm not leaving you, she said firmly. We're going to find another way. But, even as she said the words, Sarah knew the situation was desperate. The enemy was closing in from multiple directions, her team had abandoned her, and she was running out of time and options. Another artillery shell landed close enough to shower them with dirt and debris. Sarah made her decision. She helped Sullivan move to a more secure hiding spot behind a concrete barrier, gave him her emergency medical supplies, and prepared to attempt something that probably qualified as either very brave or completely insane. I'm going to get that intelligence, she told Sullivan. Stay hidden and stay alive. That's an order. Sullivan nodded weakly. Be careful, Captain. Something about this whole mission stinks. Sarah knew he was right. The enemy had been waiting for them, knew their exact positions and timing. Someone had leaked information about their operation. The question was who, and whether her own team members were involved in the betrayal. She began moving toward the maintenance tunnel, staying low and using the cover of smoke and debris from the ongoing bombardment. Behind her, she could hear enemy soldiers getting closer to Sullivan's position. She had to move fast. The tunnel entrance was older than she had expected, probably dating back to the warehouse district's construction decades earlier. The opening was just wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it disappeared into darkness beyond her night vision range. Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed into the tunnel. The space was cramped and filled with years of accumulated debris, but it seemed structurally sound. She began crawling toward what she hoped was the warehouse foundation. The tunnel system was more extensive than she had anticipated. It branched off in multiple directions, connecting several of the warehouse buildings in the district. Sarah realized that she might be able to access not just the enemy command center, but potentially several other important locations as well. As she crawled through the darkness, Sarah's radio crackled back to life. She could hear Rodriguez's voice coordinating with the extraction team. Delta 2 to Overwatch. We are at the extraction point. Request immediate pickup. Mission is a failure, and we have casualties. Sarah's anger flared. Rodriguez was reporting casualties when he didn't even know her status. He was writing her off as dead or captured without making any effort to verify her condition. She keyed her radio carefully, keeping her voice low. Delta 2, this is Delta 1. I am still alive and continuing the mission. Do not extract without me. There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded. Delta 1, your position is overrun. The mission is compromised. We cannot wait. The mission is not over until I say it's over, Sarah transmitted back. Give me 30 minutes. Another pause. Then, Rodriguez's voice came back with words that Sarah would never forget. I'm sorry, Sarah. You're on your own. The radio went silent again, and this time Sarah knew it wasn't coming back. Her own team had officially abandoned her in enemy territory. Sarah continued crawling through the tunnel system, driven now by more than just duty. She was going to complete this mission and get the intelligence her command needed, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because she was going to prove that her team had made a terrible mistake in abandoning her. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Sarah could see light filtering down from above. She was approaching the warehouse foundation. She could hear voices speaking in the enemy language, along with the sounds of equipment being moved around. Sarah found a ventilation grate that gave her a view into the warehouse interior. What she saw exceeded her wildest expectations for valuable intelligence. The enemy wasn't just using this location as a supply depot. They had established a major command and control center here, complete with communication equipment that was clearly being used to coordinate operations across the entire region. She could see maps showing troop movements, supply schedules, and what appeared to be plans for a major offensive operation. Even more importantly, she could see several high-ranking enemy officers discussing what was obviously a significant strategic decision. If she could get close enough to record their conversation, the intelligence value would be enormous. Sarah began looking for a way to get closer without being detected. The tunnel system seemed to continue underneath the warehouse floor, with several access points that might allow her to position herself within listening range of the enemy officers. As she prepared to move deeper into the facility, Sarah made a promise to herself. She was going to gather enough intelligence to turn the tide of this entire conflict. And when she got back to base, she was going to have some very serious questions for Lieutenant Rodriguez about why he had been so eager to abandon the mission. The enemy had no idea that their secure command center had been infiltrated by a single determined soldier who had been abandoned by her own team. Sarah Chun was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous person on a battlefield is someone who has nothing left to lose. She began crawling toward the voices, her recording equipment ready, her determination stronger than ever. The real mission was just beginning. Sarah positioned herself beneath a loose floorboard in the warehouse, close enough to hear the enemy officers, but hidden in the shadows of the underground tunnel system. Through a small gap in the wooden planks above her, she could see 3 high-ranking officials studying a large tactical map spread across a metal table. The tallest officer, wearing the insignia of a colonel, was speaking in measured tones about something called Operation Crimson Dawn. Sarah activated her digital recording device and began documenting everything she could hear and see. The Western supply routes are completely secure, the colonel was saying. Our intelligence indicates that the enemy's reconnaissance capabilities in this sector have been neutralized. The strike teams were eliminated as planned. Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't just talking about her mission. They were talking about multiple reconnaissance teams that had been ambushed and destroyed. Her squad wasn't the first to walk into a trap. A shorter officer with major's insignia pointed to several locations on the map. Phase 2 can begin at dawn tomorrow. Once we control these 3 bridges, their entire northern defensive line will collapse within 72 hours. The third officer, a woman wearing captain's bars, consulted a thick folder of documents. Confirmed. Our sources inside their command structure have provided exact positions for all defensive installations. They have no idea what's coming. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The enemy had infiltrated their own command structure. Someone high up in her own military was feeding information directly to the enemy, allowing them to plan devastating attacks against their own forces. She carefully adjusted her position to get a better view of the documents on the table. Through her small viewing gap, she could make out detailed maps showing not just current enemy positions, but planned attack routes, timing schedules, and troop deployment numbers for what appeared to be a massive coordinated offensive. Operation Crimson Dawn wasn't just another enemy attack. It was a complete strategy designed to break through their defensive lines and capture 3 major cities within a week. The enemy had enough detailed intelligence about friendly forces to plan their offensive down to the hour. The female captain pulled out what looked like communication transcripts. The next reconnaissance team is scheduled to arrive at grid reference 347 tomorrow at 0800 hours. Same treatment as the others. Sarah realized with growing horror that another friendly team was walking into the same kind of trap that had destroyed her own squad. She had to find a way to warn them, but first she needed to gather as much intelligence as possible about the overall operation. The colonel moved to a different section of the map, pointing to an area that Sarah recognized as the location of their main supply depot. Phase 3 requires precise timing. The supply depot attack must begin exactly at 1400 hours, coordinated with the bridge operations. Our source has confirmed that their security rotation changes at 1345, giving us a 15-minute window. Sarah's mind raced as she realized the scope of the betrayal. Someone with access to detailed operational security schedules was providing information to the enemy. That level of access suggested involvement from someone very high in the command structure, possibly at the general officer level. She continued recording as the officers discussed specific units, casualty estimates, and contingency plans. The enemy knew not just where friendly forces were located, but how they would respond to different types of attacks. They had planned countermoves for every possible defensive strategy. After 30 minutes of documentation, Sarah had gathered enough information to potentially save thousands of lives and prevent a major military disaster. But she still needed to find a way to escape the warehouse and get the intelligence back to her own forces. The tunnel system offered several possible escape routes, but Sarah knew that once she left the warehouse area, she would be completely on her own in hostile territory. Her team had abandoned her, and she had no backup plan for extraction. As she prepared to move toward an exit route, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in place. One of the officers was speaking into a radio, and she recognized the voice on the other end of the conversation. Overwatch Control, this is Colonel Morrison. Phase 1 was successful. The reconnaissance teams have been eliminated as planned. Sarah knew that voice. Colonel Morrison was the commanding officer of her own base, the man who had personally briefed her team before the mission. He was the traitor providing intelligence to the enemy. Everything suddenly made sense. Morrison had designed the reconnaissance mission to fail, sending her team into a known trap. Rodriguez's quick decision to abandon the mission wasn't cowardice or poor judgment. He was following orders from Morrison to ensure that Sarah and anyone who might discover the betrayal would be eliminated. Sarah realized that Sullivan was probably already dead, killed by enemy forces who knew exactly where to find him. Her own team members might be innocent pawns in Morrison's plan, or they might be active participants in the betrayal. Either way, she was now completely alone with information that could expose a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of military command. The enemy colonel continued his conversation with Morrison. Excellent. Phase 2 will begin at dawn. Are you certain that the northern defensive positions will be unmanned during the window we discussed? Morrison's voice came back clearly through the radio speaker. Confirmed. I will ensure that the 3rd Battalion is pulled back for maintenance exercises at exactly 0530 hours tomorrow morning. The bridges will be completely undefended. Sarah felt rage building inside her as she listened to Morrison casually discuss the planned deaths of hundreds of soldiers under his command. These weren't just military statistics to her. She knew many of the soldiers in 3rd Battalion personally. They were good people who trusted their commanding officer to keep them safe. She continued recording the conversation, documenting Morrison's direct involvement in planning enemy attacks against his own forces. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but Sarah knew that getting it back to the right people would be nearly impossible. Morrison wasn't just providing intelligence to the enemy. He was actively coordinating attacks against friendly forces and eliminating anyone who might discover his activities. Sarah was now the only person who knew the truth, and she was trapped behind enemy lines with no support and no extraction plan. The conversation ended, and the enemy officers began preparing to leave the warehouse. Sarah realized that her opportunity to gather intelligence was ending, but she also saw a chance to escape. If she could follow the officers out of the warehouse, she might be able to find a safer route through the city. She began moving through the tunnel system toward what appeared to be an exit point near the warehouse's loading dock. The space was cramped and filled with debris, but it offered concealment as she tracked the movements of the enemy personnel above. As Sarah crawled through the tunnels, she thought about her options for getting the intelligence back to friendly forces. She couldn't trust normal military communication channels, since Morrison might intercept any transmissions. She needed to find someone outside the regular command structure who could take action on the information she had gathered. The tunnel exit emerged behind a pile of rubble about 200 meters from the warehouse. Sarah waited until the area was clear, then carefully climbed out and began moving through the ruins of the industrial district. The city had been heavily damaged by months of warfare, but Sarah knew that there were still civilian populations hiding in some areas. If she could make contact with resistance groups or civilian authorities, she might be able to get word back to higher military command levels that were outside Morrison's influence. Sarah's immediate priority was finding somewhere safe to review the intelligence she had gathered and plan her next moves. She needed to identify exactly which units were at risk from the planned attacks and find a way to warn them before it was too late. As she moved through the rubble-strewn streets, Sarah heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching the warehouse district. Enemy reinforcements were arriving, probably to begin preparations for the dawn offensive. Time was running out. She found temporary shelter in the basement of a partially collapsed office building and began reviewing her recordings. The intelligence she had gathered was even more devastating than she had initially realized. Operation Crimson Dawn wasn't just a military offensive. It was a coordinated plan to capture key strategic positions that would allow the enemy to cut off supplies to major population centers. Thousands of civilians would be trapped without food, medical supplies, or evacuation routes. Morrison's betrayal extended beyond just military intelligence. He had provided information about civilian evacuation plans, refugee camp locations, and humanitarian supply routes. The enemy was planning to target non-combatants as part of their strategy to force a quick surrender. Sarah realized that she wasn't just carrying information that could save military personnel. She had intelligence that could prevent a humanitarian disaster affecting hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Sarah felt a renewed determination to complete her mission. She had been abandoned by her own team and betrayed by her commanding officer, but she still had a duty to protect the people counting on military forces to keep them safe. She began planning a route toward the nearest friendly outpost that was outside Morrison's direct command authority. It would mean traveling over 50 kilometers through hostile territory, but it was her only option for getting the intelligence to people who could act on it. As Sarah prepared to leave her temporary shelter, she heard voices outside the building. Enemy patrols were conducting a systematic search of the area, probably looking for any survivors from the reconnaissance teams. She gathered her equipment and moved deeper into the building's basement levels, looking for another exit route. The voices were getting closer, and Sarah knew that discovery would mean not just her death, but the loss of intelligence that could save thousands of lives. The basement connected to an old subway tunnel that had been abandoned years before the war began. Sarah followed the tunnel eastward, away from the warehouse district and toward the outskirts of the city. As she walked through the darkness, Sarah made a promise to herself and to all the soldiers and civilians who were depending on her success. She would get this intelligence to the right people, no matter what it took. Morrison's betrayal would be exposed, the planned attacks would be stopped, and justice would be served. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of enemy forces continuing their preparations for the dawn offensive. But they had no idea that their plans had been discovered by a single determined soldier who refused to give up, even when abandoned by everyone she had trusted. Sarah Chun was carrying more than just intelligence through the dark tunnels beneath the city. She was carrying the hopes of everyone who still believed that honor and duty meant something in a world torn apart by war and betrayal. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched for miles beneath the war-torn city, its walls covered with decades of rust and decay. Sarah moved carefully through the darkness, using her flashlight sparingly to conserve battery power. Every step echoed in the confined space, making her painfully aware of how alone she was in enemy territory. After walking for 3 hours, Sarah reached what appeared to be an old maintenance station. The small chamber offered enough space for her to rest and examine her situation more carefully. She spread out her tactical map and began planning her route to the nearest friendly outpost outside Morrison's command authority. The closest option was Firebase Delta, a small installation 42 kilometers northeast of her current position. The base was under the command of Colonel Rebecca Martinez, an officer Sarah had worked with briefly during a joint training exercise. Martinez had a reputation for integrity and independence from political influences within the military hierarchy. But reaching Firebase Delta would require crossing 2 major rivers, navigating through at least 15 kilometers of known enemy territory, and avoiding numerous checkpoints and patrol routes. Sarah estimated the journey would take at least 3 days on foot, assuming she could avoid detection and find sources of food and water along the way. As she studied the map, Sarah heard sounds echoing through the tunnel from the direction she had come. Voices and footsteps suggested that enemy forces had discovered the subway entrance and were beginning to search the underground passages. Sarah quickly gathered her equipment and continued deeper into the tunnel system. She needed to put distance between herself and the search teams before finding a place to rest. The intelligence she carried was too valuable to risk capture now. The tunnel branched in several directions, and Sarah chose a route that seemed to head toward the eastern suburbs of the city. According to her map, this area had been largely abandoned since the beginning of the conflict, which meant fewer enemy patrols, but also fewer opportunities to find supplies or assistance. As she walked, Sarah thought about the magnitude of Morrison's betrayal. He hadn't just sold out military positions and troop movements. The intelligence she had recorded showed that he was providing the enemy with information about civilian evacuation plans, medical facility locations, and humanitarian supply routes. The planned offensive would target schools being used as refugee centers, hospitals treating wounded civilians, and distribution points providing food and medical supplies to trapped populations. Morrison wasn't just committing treason against his own military. He was orchestrating war crimes against innocent noncombatants. Sarah's anger gave her strength to continue through the exhaustion and stress of her situation. Every step brought her closer to exposing Morrison's crimes and preventing the humanitarian disaster he was helping to plan. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Sarah could see daylight filtering down from above. She found an access ladder leading to what appeared to be a storm drain opening in a residential area. The buildings around the drainage outlet were badly damaged but still standing, offering potential concealment. Sarah climbed carefully out of the underground passage and found herself in what had once been a middle-class neighborhood. The houses were empty now, their windows broken and walls scarred by months of artillery bombardments. But the damage also provided excellent cover for movement through the area. She moved from building to building, staying low and avoiding open spaces. Her military training in urban warfare served her well as she navigated through the ruins without exposing herself to observation from potential enemy positions. In the basement of a partially collapsed house, Sarah found something unexpected: a civilian family hiding in a makeshift shelter. An elderly man, a woman in her 30s, and 2 young children had been living in the rubble for weeks, surviving on stored food and rainwater. The family was terrified when Sarah appeared, obviously expecting the worst from anyone wearing military gear. But when Sarah spoke to them in their own language and identified herself as a friendly soldier, they began to trust her enough to share information about enemy movements in the area. The elderly man, who introduced himself as Victor, had been observing enemy patrols from his hiding spot for weeks. He had detailed knowledge of patrol schedules, checkpoint locations, and safe routes through the surrounding neighborhoods. The enemy soldiers come through here every morning at dawn and every evening at sunset, Victor explained. But during the middle of the day and late at night, this area is usually empty. They don't think anyone is still living here. Victor's daughter, Anna, showed Sarah a hand-drawn map of the local area with enemy positions marked in pencil. We've been trying to find a way to reach the refugee camps in the south, but there are too many patrols between here and safety. Sarah realized that she might be able to help the family while also advancing her own mission. If she could guide them toward a safer area, they might be able to provide her with local knowledge and assistance in reaching Firebase Delta. But helping the family would also slow her down and increase the risk of detection. Sarah had to balance her desire to help innocent civilians against the urgent need to deliver intelligence that could save thousands of other lives. She made her decision quickly. "I'm heading northeast toward friendly forces," she told the family. "If you want to come with me, I can provide protection and guidance. But the journey will be dangerous, and we'll be moving through enemy territory." Victor consulted quietly with his daughter before responding. "We will come with you. Staying here means slow death from hunger and cold. At least traveling with you gives us hope of reaching safety." Sarah spent the next hour helping the family prepare for travel. They had few possessions, but Victor had managed to preserve a detailed knowledge of the local terrain that would prove invaluable for navigation. Anna had basic medical training and carried a small supply of bandages and antibiotics. The children, a boy of about 8 and a girl of perhaps 6, were surprisingly resilient despite their ordeal. They understood the need for silence and stealth without requiring lengthy explanations. Their presence would complicate Sarah's mission, but it also reminded her of why the intelligence she carried was so important. As evening approached, Sarah led the family out of their hiding place and began moving northeast through the abandoned neighborhoods. Victor's knowledge of patrol schedules proved accurate, and they encountered no enemy forces during their first few hours of travel. The group moved slowly but steadily through the ruins, stopping frequently to rest and observe the area ahead. Sarah maintained constant communication with the family through hand signals and whispered instructions, ensuring that everyone understood their route and contingency plans. During their second night of travel, Sarah's radio equipment picked up enemy communications that provided additional confirmation of the planned offensive. The transmissions she intercepted indicated that Operation Crimson Dawn was proceeding on schedule, with attack forces moving into position for the dawn assault. Sarah realized that they were running out of time. The offensive would begin in less than 36 hours, and she was still more than 20 kilometers from Firebase Delta. Even if she abandoned the family and traveled alone, reaching the base in time to prevent the attack would require pushing herself to the limits of human endurance. But abandoning the family was not an option Sarah was willing to consider. Victor and Anna had risked their lives to help her navigate through enemy territory. The children trusted her to keep them safe. Sarah had already been abandoned once during this mission, and she refused to abandon others who were counting on her. She made the decision to push harder, accepting greater risks in exchange for faster movement toward their destination. Instead of avoiding all enemy positions, Sarah began planning a route that would take them closer to patrol routes, but offer more direct paths to Firebase Delta. The strategy worked initially. By taking calculated risks and using Victor's knowledge of enemy patterns, the group covered 15 kilometers in their second day of travel. But their luck ran out as they approached the outskirts of a small town that controlled access to the bridge they needed to cross. Enemy forces had established a checkpoint at the bridge, with at least a dozen soldiers and armored vehicles controlling all approaches. Sarah observed the position for hours, looking for weaknesses or gaps in their security, but the enemy had chosen their location well. Victor suggested an alternative crossing point about 3 kilometers upstream, where the river was shallower and might be fordable without using the bridge. But reaching that location would require circling around the town through areas that Sarah knew were heavily patrolled. As Sarah weighed their options, she intercepted another enemy radio transmission that changed everything. The transmission was from Morrison himself, providing final updates to the enemy command about friendly force positions for the next day's offensive. Morrison's voice came through clearly as he provided detailed information about defensive weak points, supply depot locations, and evacuation routes that would be used by civilian populations fleeing the attack areas. He wasn't just betraying military personnel anymore. He was actively assisting in planning attacks on refugee convoys and civilian shelters. Sarah's determination hardened into something approaching obsession. She was going to reach Firebase Delta, deliver the intelligence about Operation Crimson Dawn, and ensure that Morrison faced justice for his crimes. The family she was protecting and thousands of other innocent people depended on her success. She began planning an assault on the checkpoint that would clear the way for their crossing. It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but Sarah had learned during her years of military service that sometimes desperate situations required desperate solutions. Victor surprised her by offering an alternative approach. "I know these soldiers," he said quietly. "Some of them have been stationed here for months. They are tired, homesick, and not as alert as they should be. If we wait until late night, I might be able to create a distraction that would allow you to pass." Sarah listened as Victor outlined a plan based on his weeks of observing the checkpoint operations. The enemy soldiers had developed predictable routines and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with detailed knowledge of their habits. It was still an extremely risky plan, but it offered better odds than a direct assault. Sarah began preparing for what might be the most crucial phase of her mission, crossing the bridge that stood between her and the ability to save thousands of lives. As she checked her equipment and reviewed the intelligence recordings one more time, Sarah reflected on how much her situation had changed since the beginning of the mission. She had started as part of a 5-person reconnaissance team with full support and backup plans. Now she was leading a family of civilian refugees through enemy territory, carrying intelligence that could change the course of the war. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but Sarah felt stronger and more determined than she had at any point since her team had abandoned her. She was no longer fighting just for military objectives or career advancement. She was fighting for the basic human values that made military service meaningful: protecting the innocent, serving something greater than yourself, and standing up for what is right even when you have to stand alone. Victor's plan was simple but required precise timing and nerves of steel. The enemy checkpoint had a weakness that only someone who had observed it for weeks would notice. Every night at approximately 2 a.m., the guards would gather in their command bunker to eat a hot meal and warm themselves around a portable heater. For exactly 20 minutes, only 2 sentries remained outside to watch the bridge approaches. During those 20 minutes, Victor explained, there was a blind spot on the eastern side of the bridge where shadows from the damaged support structures created a corridor of darkness invisible from the sentry positions. A small group could cross the bridge during this window, but only if they moved quickly and silently. Sarah studied the checkpoint through her binoculars, confirming Victor's observations about the guard rotation schedule. The enemy soldiers did appear tired and complacent, following predictable routines that indicated they hadn't encountered any significant threats in weeks. What about creating the distraction you mentioned? Sarah asked. Victor smiled grimly. There is an old fuel depot about half a kilometer west of the checkpoint. The tanks are empty, but they still contain enough residual vapor to create a very impressive explosion if ignited properly. The guards will think they are under attack and will focus their attention in that direction. Anna looked concerned about her father's proposal. The explosion might bring more enemy soldiers to the area. We could find ourselves trapped between multiple patrols. Sarah considered the risks carefully. Victor's plan offered their best chance of crossing the bridge, but it also might trigger a massive enemy response that would make their continued journey impossible. However, time was running out. Operation Crimson Dawn would begin in less than 18 hours, and they were still 15 kilometers from Firebase Delta. We'll do it, Sarah decided. Victor, can you reach the fuel depot and return to the crossing point within 30 minutes? Yes, but I will need someone to help me carry the materials for the explosion device. I am not as young as I used to be. Sarah looked at Anna, who nodded without hesitation. I'll go with him. The children can stay hidden here with you until we return. Sarah didn't like the idea of splitting up the group, but Victor's plan was their best option for crossing the checkpoint. She helped Victor and Anna gather the materials they would need to create an improvised explosive device, using supplies from her own equipment combined with items they had scavenged during their journey. As Victor and Anna prepared to leave for the fuel depot, Sarah established a hiding place for the children in the ruins of a small house overlooking the bridge. The location offered excellent concealment while providing clear views of both the checkpoint and the western approach where the explosion would occur. Remember, Sarah told the children, no matter what happens, stay hidden until either your mother returns or I come to get you. If you hear gunfire or see enemy soldiers coming this way, move deeper into the ruins and find a place where you cannot be seen. The boy, whose name was Dmitri, nodded solemnly. His sister Katia clutched a small stuffed animal and whispered, Will Mama be safe? Sarah knelt down to look Katia in the eyes. Your mother is very brave, and your grandfather is very smart. They are going to help us cross the bridge so we can all reach safety together. As Victor and Anna disappeared into the darkness toward the fuel depot, Sarah settled in to wait and observe the checkpoint. She used the time to review her intelligence recordings one more time, ensuring that all critical information was properly documented and backed up on multiple storage devices. The recordings contained enough evidence to expose Morrison's betrayal and prevent Operation Crimson Dawn, but only if she could deliver them to the right people in time. Colonel Martinez at Firebase Delta had the authority and resources to act on the intelligence immediately, bypassing Morrison's influence within the command structure. Sarah thought about her team members who had abandoned her at the warehouse. She still didn't know whether Rodriguez, Park, and Wong were actively involved in Morrison's conspiracy, or if they had simply followed orders without understanding the larger picture. Either way, their decision to abandon the mission had nearly prevented the discovery of information that could save thousands of lives. 40 minutes after Victor and Anna had left, Sarah saw a bright flash of light followed by the thunderous sound of an explosion from the direction of the fuel depot. The blast was much larger than she had expected, creating a column of fire that lit up the night sky for several seconds. The reaction at the checkpoint was immediate and dramatic. Guards came running out of their bunkers, vehicles started their engines, and radio chatter filled the airwaves as the enemy tried to determine what had happened. Within minutes, most of the checkpoint personnel had deployed toward the explosion site, leaving only 3 soldiers to guard the bridge. Sarah waited for Victor and Anna to return, but as the minutes passed, she began to worry that something had gone wrong. The explosion had been successful, but the response had been stronger than anticipated. Enemy patrols were moving throughout the area, searching for whoever had attacked the fuel depot. After an hour of waiting, Sarah made a difficult decision. Victor and Anna might be hiding from enemy patrols, or they might have been captured or killed. Either way, Sarah couldn't wait any longer. Operation Crimson Dawn would begin at dawn, and she had to reach Firebase Delta with enough time to organize a response. She gathered Dmitri and Katya and explained the situation as gently as possible. "We need to cross the bridge now, while most of the guards are still away. Your mother and grandfather created the perfect distraction for us, but we have to use it quickly." Dmitri understood immediately, but Katya began crying quietly. "I want Mama," she whispered. Sarah picked up the little girl and held her close. "I know you do. We're going to find your Mama after we cross the bridge and reach safety. But right now, we need to be very brave and very quiet." The crossing was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Carrying Katya while guiding Dmitri through the shadows required all of her skill and experience in stealth movement. The remaining guards were alert and nervous after the explosion, sweeping the area with searchlights and maintaining constant radio contact with their patrols. But Victor's observations about the blind spot proved accurate. Sarah and the children were able to move through the shadows beneath the bridge supports without being detected by the sentries. The crossing took 12 agonizing minutes of slow, careful movement, but they reached the eastern side without raising any alarms. Once across the bridge, Sarah led the children to a safe hiding place and established radio contact with Firebase Delta. Colonel Martinez responded personally to Sarah's emergency transmission, and her reaction to the intelligence about Operation Crimson Dawn was immediate and decisive. "Captain Chun, this is Colonel Martinez. I'm reading you clearly. Are you certain about the authenticity of this intelligence?" "Yes, ma'am. I have recorded conversations between enemy officers and Colonel Morrison planning coordinated attacks on multiple targets. The offensive begins at dawn." There was a brief pause before Martinez responded. "Understood. I'm initiating Emergency Protocol Alpha immediately. All friendly units will be notified of the threat within the hour. Captain, I need you to transmit all intelligence data to my secure channel immediately." Sarah began uploading the recordings and documentation she had gathered, using her encrypted communication equipment to send the files directly to Martinez's command center. The transmission took nearly 30 minutes, but when it was complete, Sarah knew that the intelligence was finally in the hands of someone who could act on it. "Captain Chun, this intelligence is extraordinary. You've potentially saved thousands of lives tonight. I'm dispatching a rescue team to extract you and any civilians with you immediately." "Thank you, ma'am. But I need to inform you that there are 2 adult civilians, Victor and Anna, who may be trapped or captured near the bridge checkpoint. They risked their lives to help me reach you." "Understood. My teams will search for them during the extraction operation." "Captain, I want you to know that what you've accomplished tonight represents the finest traditions of military service. Your dedication to duty under impossible circumstances is exemplary." As Sarah waited for the extraction team, she comforted Dmitri and Katya and tried to process everything that had happened since her team had abandoned her at the warehouse. In less than 48 hours, she had discovered a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of military command, gathered intelligence that could prevent a major enemy offensive, and led a family of refugees to safety through hostile territory. But the mission wasn't over yet. Morrison was still in command of friendly forces, still in a position to cause damage even if Operation Crimson Dawn had been prevented. Sarah knew that exposing his betrayal would require more than just intelligence recordings. It would require testimony from someone who had witnessed his crimes directly. The extraction team arrived just before dawn, led by Major Thompson, an officer Sarah had worked with during training exercises. Thompson's team included medical personnel who immediately began treating the children for exhaustion and malnutrition, as well as specialists who helped Sarah secure and document all of her intelligence materials. "Captain, we have good news about the civilians who helped you." Thompson reported. Victor and Anna were found hiding in the ruins near the fuel depot. They're injured but alive, and they're being evacuated to our medical facility. Sarah felt a surge of relief that the family would be reunited safely. Victor and Anna had risked everything to help a stranger complete her mission, and their courage had been essential to preventing Operation Crimson Dawn. As the extraction helicopter lifted off, carrying Sarah and the children toward Firebase Delta, she could see the first signs of dawn breaking over the war-torn landscape. In a few hours, enemy forces would have been launching coordinated attacks against unprepared friendly positions, targeting military installations and civilian shelters alike. Instead, Colonel Martinez's early warning had allowed friendly forces to prepare defensive positions, evacuate vulnerable areas, and position counterattack forces to disrupt enemy operations. Operation Crimson Dawn would fail before it began, saving countless military and civilian lives. But Sarah knew that her most important work still lay ahead. Morrison's betrayal had to be fully exposed and prosecuted, not just to punish his crimes, but to prevent similar conspiracies from developing in the future. The intelligence she had gathered provided evidence of his guilt, but bringing him to justice would require navigating the complex politics of military command structures and ensuring that other corrupt officers couldn't cover up his crimes. As the helicopter approached Firebase Delta, Sarah thought about the team members who had abandoned her and wondered what their fate would be when Morrison's conspiracy was exposed. Were they innocent pawns who had followed orders without understanding the larger picture? Or were they active participants in a conspiracy that had nearly resulted in a military and humanitarian disaster? Either way, Sarah knew that her relationship with those soldiers was over forever. She had learned that in the most critical moments, the only person you can truly count on is yourself. But she had also learned that sometimes one person with courage and determination can make a difference that changes the course of history. The mission that had begun as a simple reconnaissance operation had become something much more significant, a test of everything Sarah believed about duty, honor, and the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform. She had passed that test, but the cost had been higher than she ever could have imagined when she first entered the warehouse where her team had abandoned her to face the enemy alone. Firebase Delta buzzed with activity as Colonel Martinez's staff worked through the night to coordinate the response to Sarah's intelligence. Within hours of receiving the Operation Crimson Dawn recordings, friendly forces across the entire region had been repositioned to counter the planned enemy offensive. Sarah watched from the command center as reports came in confirming that her warnings had prevented a catastrophic surprise attack. The enemy forces, expecting to find unprepared defensive positions, instead encountered well-coordinated resistance at every target location. The bridges they had planned to capture were heavily defended, their supply depot attacks were repelled with significant losses, and their attempts to target civilian evacuation routes were blocked by prepositioned security forces. But Sarah's satisfaction at the mission's success was tempered by the knowledge that the most difficult part still lay ahead. Colonel Morrison remained in command of his base, unaware that his conspiracy had been exposed. Bringing him to justice would require careful planning to prevent him from destroying evidence or eliminating witnesses. Colonel Martinez called Sarah into her private office to discuss the situation. "Captain Chun, the evidence you've provided is compelling, but prosecuting a senior officer for treason requires absolute certainty. I need you to be completely honest with me about every detail of what you witnessed and recorded." Sarah spent the next 3 hours providing a complete debriefing about her mission, from the initial warehouse investigation through her escape and journey to Firebase Delta. Martinez's staff recorded everything and cross-referenced Sarah's account with the intelligence recordings to build a comprehensive case file. "The recordings are clear evidence of Morrison's betrayal," Martinez concluded. "But we need to move carefully. Morrison has allies throughout the command structure, and if he learns that we're investigating him, he could disappear or destroy additional evidence." Martinez outlined a plan to secretly investigate Morrison's activities while gathering additional evidence of his conspiracy. Sarah would be temporarily assigned to Martinez's staff, officially for debriefing and medical evaluation, while actually serving as a key witness in the investigation. "What about my team members?" Sarah asked. "Rodriguez, Park, and Wang may have information about Morrison's involvement in planning the mission. Martinez's expression grew serious. That's a complicated situation, Captain. Your team members are currently listed as missing in action, presumed captured or killed. They never returned to their base after reporting that you had been lost during the mission. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. Either her team members had been captured or killed by enemy forces after abandoning her, or they had gone into hiding to avoid questions about their role in the mission failure. Ma'am, there's something else you need to know. During my escape, I overheard Rodriguez coordinating with the extraction team. He specifically told them not to wait for me and reported that I was dead without confirming my status. Martinez nodded grimly. That's consistent with other information we've gathered. It appears that your entire team may have been compromised, either through Morrison's influence or through direct enemy infiltration. Over the next week, Martinez's investigation team worked to trace Morrison's activities and identify the full scope of his conspiracy. The evidence gathered from Sarah's recordings led to the discovery of additional communications between Morrison and enemy forces, financial records showing suspicious payments, and testimony from other officers who had noticed irregularities in Morrison's behavior. The investigation revealed that Morrison's betrayal extended back at least 6 months and included information about dozens of military operations. Sarah's reconnaissance mission had been just one of many operations that Morrison had deliberately compromised, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of friendly personnel. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators examined the fate of Sarah's team members. Rodriguez, Park, and Wang had not been captured by enemy forces after abandoning Sarah. They had been extracted to a secure location and were being held under protective custody by Morrison's allies, supposedly for their own safety after their traumatic experience. Martinez arranged for Sarah to observe secretly as investigators interviewed her former team members. The conversations revealed that Rodriguez had been directly recruited by Morrison months earlier and had been feeding information about reconnaissance missions to enemy forces. Park and Wang were not active conspirators, but they had followed Rodriguez's orders without question, even when those orders contradicted proper military procedures. Rodriguez convinced them that you had been killed and that continuing the mission would result in their deaths as well, Martinez explained to Sarah. Park and Wang believed they were following proper emergency protocols when they abandoned you. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions as she learned the truth about her team's betrayal. Rodriguez had deliberately led them into a trap and then abandoned her to die, while Park and Wang had been manipulated into participating in a conspiracy they didn't understand. The legal proceedings against Morrison and Rodriguez began 3 weeks after Sarah's return to Firebase Delta. The military tribunal included judges from outside Morrison's command authority, ensuring that the conspiracy couldn't influence the trial proceedings. Sarah's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Her detailed account of Morrison's communications with enemy forces, combined with the recorded evidence she had gathered, provided overwhelming proof of treason and conspiracy. Morrison's defense team attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by questioning her mental state and suggesting that the stress of her mission had caused her to misinterpret innocent communications. But the recorded evidence was too clear and detailed to dismiss. Colonel Morrison, the chief prosecutor, stated during closing arguments, deliberately provided classified information to enemy forces, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of friendly personnel and nearly causing a humanitarian disaster affecting thousands of civilians. Captain Chen's courage in exposing this conspiracy prevented a catastrophic enemy victory. The tribunal deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict. Morrison was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Rodriguez received a 20-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Park and Wang faced disciplinary action for failing to follow proper procedures, but were allowed to remain in service after additional training. The conclusion of the legal proceedings brought Sarah a sense of closure, but also raised questions about her future in the military. Her experience had shown her both the best and worst aspects of military service, and she struggled with whether she wanted to continue her career in an organization that had nearly abandoned her to die. Colonel Martinez offered Sarah a permanent assignment to her staff, with opportunities for advancement and specialized training in intelligence operations. Captain, what you accomplished during that mission represents the finest traditions of military service. Your courage, determination, and integrity saved thousands of lives and exposed corruption that might have continued for years. Sarah appreciated Martinez's offer, but she needed time to consider her options. The mission had changed her in fundamental ways, and she wanted to ensure that her decision about continuing military service was based on careful consideration rather than immediate emotions. 3 months after the trial concluded, Sarah made her decision. She would remain in the military, but with a new focus on training and mentoring junior officers. Her experience had taught her valuable lessons about leadership, integrity, and the importance of individual responsibility in military operations. Sarah's first assignment in her new role was developing training programs to help soldiers recognize and respond to compromised missions. She worked with Martinez's staff to create realistic scenarios that would prepare soldiers for situations where they might be abandoned by their teams or betrayed by their commanders. The most important lesson, Sarah told her first group of trainees, is that your duty to protect innocent people and serve your country never depends on what other people do. Even when you're abandoned by everyone you trusted, you still have the responsibility to do what's right. Sarah also maintained contact with Victor, Anna, and their children, who had been relocated to a safe area far from the conflict zone. The family had provided crucial assistance during her mission, and Sarah felt a personal responsibility to ensure their continued safety and well-being. Victor wrote to Sarah regularly, providing updates about their new life and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to start over in a peaceful location. His letters reminded Sarah that military service was ultimately about protecting people like Victor's family, ordinary civilians who deserve to live their lives without fear of war and violence. The intelligence Sarah had gathered during her mission continued to provide valuable information long after Operation Crimson Dawn was defeated. Military analysts used her recordings to identify and disrupt additional enemy intelligence networks, leading to the capture of several other infiltrators within friendly command structures. Sarah's story became a case study taught at military academies and training centers, illustrating the importance of individual initiative and moral courage in military operations. Her experience demonstrated that sometimes a single soldier with determination and integrity could make a difference that changed the course of an entire conflict. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome of her mission was the knowledge that she had remained true to her values and responsibilities even under the most difficult circumstances. She had been abandoned by her team, betrayed by her commanding officer, and left alone in enemy territory, but she had never abandoned her duty to protect the innocent and serve her country. Years later, Sarah would look back on her mission as the defining moment of her military career and her life. It was the experience that taught her the true meaning of courage, integrity, and service. She had learned that heroism isn't about being fearless or perfect, but about continuing to do what's right even when you're afraid, alone, and facing overwhelming odds. The warehouse where Sarah's team had first abandoned her was eventually recaptured by friendly forces and converted into a memorial for soldiers who had died fighting corruption and betrayal within their own ranks. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, not as a celebrated hero, but as someone who understood that the price of freedom and justice is constant vigilance against those who would abuse their positions of trust. Sarah's mission had begun as a simple reconnaissance operation, but it had become something much more significant, a reminder that in a world where institutional loyalty can be corrupted, individual integrity remains the foundation of everything worth defending. She had been abandoned by her team, but she had never abandoned her principles, and that choice had made all the difference. The intelligence she brought back had turned the tide of a war, but more importantly, it had preserved the idea that military service means something beyond following orders and advancing careers. It means standing up for what's right, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and maintaining faith in the values that make civilization possible, even when everyone around you has lost that faith. Sarah Chun had started the mission as part of a team, but she had completed it alone. In doing so, she had discovered that sometimes being alone is not the same as being abandoned, and that the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the temptation to compromise your principles when integrity becomes inconvenient. The war eventually ended, but the lessons Sarah learned during her mission continued to guide her throughout her life. She had proven to herself and others that one person with courage and determination can make a difference, even when abandoned by everyone they trusted. That knowledge became her most valuable possession, more important than any medal or commendation she would ever receive.